Can you hear me, Melissa?
Yes, I can hear you. Okay. Hello, marhaba, assalamu alaikum. Welcome everybody to this forum on al-Tatbi'a, the freedom or normalisation, Palestine, Israel and the Arab world. Thank you very much for joining us, this being Free Palestine Melbourne's first major event of this year. We're very pleased to be joined by Dr. Khaled Haroub and Dr. Ahmed Azim, who I will introduce very shortly. I do have a very unfortunate apology. Dr. Samah Sabawi is unable to join us. She is unfortunately really sick and was a very late withdrawal for us. But I think we've got a pretty good panel still. I think it's going to be an excellent discussion and I hope everyone will enjoy it. Before we start, I want to just start by showing my respect and acknowledge that we are meeting here tonight, primarily from the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I also want to acknowledge that we meet here today on the lands of many traditional owner groups from across Australia and wish to acknowledge their elders past and present and the ongoing struggle for recognition for freedom and that this remains unceded land. I wish to acknowledge all those friends and colleagues that have been my teachers and my guides on this land and taught me a lot about what it is to be a settler on this land. And in that, draw the parallel to Palestine and note that it is really impossible to experience Palestine and to understand Palestine, to know the reality of what the Palestinian struggle is for our friends and family and not be deeply confronted by what it forces us as settlers on this land to be accountable for here. I thought I'd just give a bit of information for those who don't know much about us. Free Palestine Melbourne is still a relatively new group. We're about 1 year old now. We're always welcoming of new members. We have about 25 active members in the organising committee and a really core group of some 10 organisers that we share the responsibility among ourselves. It's really fluid. People put their hands up according to their skills and their availability. So we're always welcoming anyone new to join us. We've got a few of our key organisers behind the scenes helping us out tonight. You probably see some of their names on the screen. We're a mix of writers, academics, teachers, designers, scientists, students, engineers, restaurant owners, journalists, retirees, and just community organisers. So anyone is welcome. We meet on the second Saturday of every month. So that would actually be this coming Saturday would be our usual meeting. There is a major refugee rally in Melbourne this weekend. So we have put that meeting back to Sunday, the 14th of February. If anyone wants to join that meeting, you're very welcome. Send us an email and we'll send you the Zoom details. Hopefully from March, we'll be back to meeting face-to-face, and we usually meet at the Kathleen Syme Library near the University of Melbourne campus in Carlton. So you're welcome to just show up at that once a month. A few other details are going into the chat there, so you can find out a bit more about us, but we do run a newsletter that once a month. If you want to sign up to that, it's info@fpmelbourne.org. We also run a website. There's a regular blog there. We run a Facebook page that is increasingly active with lots of information. And we are also entirely volunteer run. These events do cost us so that we ensure we have a degree of professionalism with the Zoom and those sorts of things. And also so that we have a wide reach, so that bringing new people into the Palestinian struggle. So we do welcome donations. They enable us to work harder to draw people in. Those details, if you want to donate, there's no requirement or anything, but those details will be put in the chat at some point. I think they've just popped in now. Final bit of housekeeping. We don't have the chat open tonight. We might open it up towards the end, the final 10 minutes, if you want to throw just general comments in. We are having the Q&A though. Some of your questions could be answered by our behind the scenes people. And we will be putting about 35 minutes of Q&A from the audience to our panel tonight. So please do be active on that Q&A. So without further ado, I want to introduce our panelists. Our first speaker is Dr. Khaled Haroub. He is a Palestinian academic specializing in the Arab region, Islam and politics. He is a professor in Middle Eastern Studies at the Northwestern University in Qatar, and previously taught Middle Eastern history and politics at Cambridge University, where he founded and directed the Cambridge Arab Media Project, and with the Center of Islamic Studies at the university. He is also a very accomplished author of several books, including Hamas, A Beginner's Guide, that was published in 2006 and updated again in 2010. So thank you, Khaled, for joining us. And our second speaker tonight is Dr. Ahmed Jamil Azim. He is a Palestinian academic in the political science department at Birzeit University in Palestine, and he joins us from Palestine today. Sorry, I should have said Khaled joins us from Doha in Qatar tonight. So Dr. Ahmed Jamil Azim, he is the chief editor of Shun Falastiniya, which is a PLO journal. He is a visiting fellow at the School of Arab and Middle Eastern Studies at Cambridge University. He was. He worked for almost 10 years at the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research in Abu Dhabi, and was awarded his doctorate from the University of Edinburgh for a thesis entitled Jerusalem and the Middle East Settlement Policy. He is also a member of the Palestinian Central Council and an advisor to the Palestinian Prime Minister. So we're very privileged to have these two very accomplished speakers. Welcome, Ahmed. So we're going to have a dynamic discussion for about 45 minutes. And I thought I'd start by just grounding us in the background of what we're here to talk about. And Khaled, my first question is to you. I'm wondering if you can explain for us what's actually happened. There are 4 Arab nations involved in this normalization with Israel, but I think there is some confusion as to what happened when and what was agreed. So I wonder if you might explain for us what happened and what it is we mean by normalization.
Okay. Well, first of all, Melissa, thank you very much for yourself and for our comrades in Australia in running this and conducting this great event, and for all your efforts regarding Palestine. I'm very happy to be with you and this great kind of group of people, especially as you have already mentioned, this is Australia where we can draw so many parallels with the current situation in Palestine. Both cases, we have so many kind of similarities in terms of the settler colonial project that had been there in Australia for centuries maybe, and nowadays for many decades in Palestine. And I'm happy to be next to my colleague Ahmed. We had our offices next to each other in Cambridge, and then at Birzeit University, when I go and teach summer courses. So it's really kind of a great occasion. Now, straight to our topic, when it comes to normalization, what do we mean by normalization is something maybe different kind of interpretations depending on who sees what and from what kind of angle. In a nutshell, and politically speaking, when it comes to Palestine, I think what is meant to indicate is to make the abnormal or the extraordinary kind of thing, the exceptional maybe condition, unaccepted condition, to make it normal. So if you have an occupier, if you have a case of occupation or a clear-cut colonial case, This is according to any maybe kind of set of values, rejected, condemned, criticized, not accepted. This is abnormal. This is kind of not normal situation. Now, if you acknowledge this, if you recognize this as this is the accepted reality, and we have to deal with this, we have to recognize it, and then we have to give legitimacy over this abnormal situation. This is kind of normalization. And it started, the whole term started maybe back with Egyptian-Israeli treaty in early 1980s, by which, let's say, Egypt became kind of normalized in terms of the perception, the perspective, the dealing with Israel. And then since then until this very moment, everything that is to do with Israel as a colonial occupier of Palestine, dealing with this entity as at a level of normal dealing with any other country, this is called for many Arabs and even beyond as kind of normalization. Despite the crimes, despite the occupation, despite all kind of the violations of whatever you, international law, international kind of resolutions, so on and so forth, long list of all these kind of things. If you have anybody, any entity, any individual, any group, any organization, any country that is violating all these kind of agreed upon values, either by the UN or by our common dignified and the humane kind of perspective, anybody again is acknowledging this violator, and then dealing with them comes under the whole term of normalization. Now, specifically about the 4 countries that you have mentioned lately in 2020, this kind of maybe disastrous year, not only for everybody, maybe globally because of Corona and so many other things, but specifically for the Palestinians, because in this year we had the so-called the deal of the century, Trump plan, and then followed by all these kind of normalization agreements. Now, with these 4 countries, I think we need to zoom out. We need to understand some kind of maybe complement them with some specific national dynamics for every single one of these countries. Generally speaking, and without just to give more space maybe to Ahmed and other questions, I think the regional dynamic is somehow summed up in my perspective in what I call the war process. We have been witnessing a war process that has replaced the peace process. The peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians since, I guess, maybe, I go back to 2003 and the American war against Iraq. Since then, roughly speaking, we have been witnessing the gradual emergence of a so-called war process where Iran now is replacing the Palestinians. And instead of having a peace process where the peace is the ultimate goal, which is beyond realization, but the focus on the process. So we need the Palestinians to be engaged in a process endlessly, and during which, maybe for 2, 3, 4 and more decades, and during this kind of period of time, we perpetuate the occupation, we kind of carry on with facts on the grounds, and then the project goes on for whatever kind of direction. Now, with the war process, we moved from this process, the peace process, to a regional process involving Iran, called the war process, that we are kind of preparing, and the whole direction is to go to war against Iran. Since 2003 until now, there is no war, because war is not kind of the ultimate goal. The threat of war is what we want to have. And under this umbrella, we can achieve so many objectives, including nowadays the normalization. So you bring in United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, because they are fearful of Iran because of the war process. You create this kind of threat and menace all the time. And then you have all these players. Somehow every one of them is blackmailed in different ways because of this. So the umbrella, the regional umbrella of what we have been witnessing in terms of normalization, in my view, is this kind of war process. Now, individually speaking, for every single individual state, we have a different, not slightly different story. With the United Arab Emirates, you have this fear from Iran, but at the same time, this lust and hunger maybe for more kind of political clout influence in the region. This is the smallest Sparta. For Saudi Arabia, well, they're not normalized yet, I hope not, but you have this fear of to stay in power. You know, Mohammed bin Salman wants to stay in power. So for Sudan, for example, you have this, well, great, not only desire, but need to be removed from the terrorism sponsoring list by the US. So they wanted badly to come out of this. So for every single one, you have a blackmailing sub-process underneath that kind of war process. So this is kind of in a nutshell. It's maybe not kind of fulfilling explanation, but at least some kind of indicators to give us some entry points into the discussion.
Yeah, no, that's a helpful context to give, and I'm going to come back to some of that as the discussion progresses. So, I mean, for our audience who maybe have not followed so closely, what we've had is first the United Arab Emirates in September, and then we had the Bahrain in October, and then we had Sudan come on board, and in most recently Morocco in December. And then, of course, Trump lost the election. So we're going to come back to that. But before we jump into the current context, I wonder, Ahmed, a question for you. And this is maybe pulling it back further historically for our audience, particularly our non-Arab audience who are not so familiar with concepts like Balad al-Shams and pan-Arab nationalism and this sort of, and also the consequences that flowed from the imperial agreements like Sykes-Picot and that sort of thing. I wonder if you might also ground this discussion in that historical context of Arab nationalism for us. Have we got Ahmed? Oh.
Thank you. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, everybody, for organizing this event. Actually, going to your question about the historical context. Yes, in general, as you know, Palestine was a part of the Ottoman Empire, and it was part of under the Turkish governing or rule. In 1917, United Kingdoms occupied the Levant, which is formed what is now Palestine, Jordan, Syria, and other areas. Iraq at that time also was under the British mandate or occupation. Palestinians used to be part of the Arab region. However, Palestinians, when the nation-state system started or introduced to the Middle East and after the First World War, and a new nation-state established, Palestine and Palestinians wanted to be there in their own nation-state. At that time, Jews, Muslims, and Christians were living together in Palestine. There was something like 5% of Jews living in Palestine at that time, and they were citizens. They were part of the community, the society in Hebron and Safed and elsewhere. But with Balfour Declaration in 1917, decided or promised Palestine to be a national home for certain religion, which is Judaism in this case. The struggle started. Palestinians wanted to have the state for Palestinians. Nevertheless, what is the religion? Islam, Christianity, Judaism. Christians at that time, for example, used to be 22% of the Jerusalem inhabitants. Now, in 2020, 2021, we have less than 2%. So we have a kind of completely different demography now in Palestine. So in general, Palestine used to be an Arab cause, part of the whole post-colonial era. And Arab countries used to see Palestine as their central cause. Actually, this is still the case up to this moment. Only this week, the Arab League decided again that Palestine is still the central cause in the Middle East, the central problem in the Middle East. However, what happened coming to the normalization, if I can go to normalization, and as similar to what Khalid said, that normalizing something that's something abnormal to make it normal. And I here remember the Palestinian thinker Khalid al-Hassan used to say that there is difference between political settlement and peace. And he used to say that you have to start at the beginning to reach a political settlement. And this is what the Palestinians are trying to do since 1988 at least, when they decided to go to non-violence resistance and to start peace process, as Khalid mentioned. We imagine and we think that we need to reach political settlements to settle conflict, reach a halfway solution, which is in the case of the Palestinians and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that they suggested that we will have two states, a Palestinian state on 22% of the historical Palestine, and another state for Israel, which will be 78% of Palestine. However, this is not accepted by Israel up to this moment. We reached agreement in 1994, more than 20 agreements that Israel is breaching now. This is not respecting any of the signed interim agreements that were supposed to be that by 1999 we were supposed to have final status agreements. But anyway, Israel even not respecting the 1994-1993 agreements. Israel tried, and the Trump administration tried first to do a kind of conflict transformation. At the beginning, in the first 2 years of this American administration, they started to say that Palestinians do not need a state. Palestinians' self-determination is not really important. That different kind of sovereignty can be applied. And what is the offer they have? The offer was that you can get better jobs, better let me say economical situation, and not economical independence, actually to be part of the Israeli market, to be labor in the Israeli settlements. This is what was proposed for us in 2017, 2018. And when it didn't work, when Palestinians said that we need our national self-determination, the Trump administration tried to bypass Palestinians, going to reach a kind of normalization, peace agreement with countries who actually have no war with Israel at any time, and to forget and to not see Palestinians who are living inside the historical Palestine. Between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there is more Arabs, Palestinians, Christians, and Muslims than Jews now. And nevertheless, Palestinians are seen that they are not qualified for a state, according to the Trump administration, that maybe after 4 years, Israel can decide if we are qualified for a state or not. So we refused this Trump administration proposal. And then, as Khalid mentioned, for many reasons, including that Trump administration built its policy in the Middle East on the following principle. In addition to the war process that Khalid explained, also it means that if you are nice to Israel, United States will be nice to you. You will not be criticized for your human rights breaching. You will not be criticized for your non-democratic regime. You will not be also you will be labeled as a terrorist anymore. If you have a problem with any neighbor countries, we will be supporting you. We will recognize your sovereignty on any territory, as long as you are accepting to start normalization agreements with Israel without consulting, without any coordination with other Arab countries or with the Palestinians. The Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, there is an Arab Peace Initiative saying that Arab countries are ready for normalization with Israel after reaching a political settlement of ending the occupation of the land occupied in 1967, which is according to the United Nations and international law is occupied. The Arab countries, include especially Saudi Arabia, suggested that if we reach such an agreement of Palestinian state on the border of 1967, normalization can start immediately. But according to Trump administration, no normalization can happen. And in the future, something can happen. Nothing is guaranteed for Palestinians. I think this is the answer if it's clear.
No, thank you. That gives us some more helpful context. And the obvious question is to jump into the major shift that's happened with the Biden administration, but I'm not going to go there yet. I wonder if, to bring it back to you, Khaled, if you could talk to the impact this had on Palestinian leadership. And this is a question I'm actually going to direct to both of you, given Ahmed is an advisor to the Prime Minister, but can you speak to the impact this had on Palestinian leadership when all of this was announced, both internally? So did it encourage Hamas and the PA to seek common ground? And is it what's sitting a little bit behind the renewed election action? And also externally, there was a noticeable contrast in this really outspoken response from the Palestinian leadership to the UAE and Bahrain normalising, and then you had Morocco and it was almost silence. I wonder if you could speak to those factors.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Melissa. Well, before coming to this important kind of debate, let me kind of maybe, if you allow me, add something else to the context. We need, all of us, to bear in mind this, for me, very fundamental fact. That is, all these normalization agreements, they were driven, designed, and signed on by authoritarian regimes. So we have to differentiate between who signs these agreements and the people themselves. So here, we are not talking about, the Emirati people. In fact, we don't hear their voice. We don't talk about the Bahraini people or the Sudanese or the Moroccans. You have in these four countries, by and large, you have authoritarian regimes, dictators basically, and then they go out and then they speak in the name of their people and they do whatever they like. So we need to pose this question all the time and to kind of limit our discussion that these agreements, again, they have been followed through and signed upon by these kind of regimes and the political elite on the top. Until this very moment, and I talk at so many panels about normalization in Arabic here and there in different countries, in Sudan, here, and then one big question, one big challenge, in fact, all the time is that where are the Bahrainis? Where are the Emiratis? Where are the Sudanese or the Moroccans? We need to hear their voices. So these agreements, up until now, we challenge all these governments to go to the street, to the Arab street. As Ahmed has said, this is still a very sacred issue for most of the Arabs, the vast majority of the Arabs and Muslims, and even any individuals across the globe who are led by dignity and the human dignity and the human rights. Can you go to conduct a referendum across the Emiratis, free and fair, and ask them about what you have done? This is the challenge, and the same challenge, to the Bahraini government, to the Moroccan government, and so on and so forth. Now, coming to your question, I think the first kind of maybe reaction was across the board, not only within the Palestinian leadership, that we have so many criticisms about this leadership, But even, you know, the Palestinian people, factions and intellectuals here and there inside Palestine, and now there's a sense of shock. Well, oh my God, is this happening? You know, Arab countries that even far away from Israel, they don't have any borders with Israel. They don't have any land that was occupied, let's say as in the case of Egypt or in the case of Jordan, and then they had this kind of transaction and the trade off. So it's kind of peace for land. You give us, you know, the land that you occupied in 1967, and then we have a peace compromise or a peace agreement. In the case of Emirates, in the case of Bahrain, there is nothing. There is no land that was occupied. So why on earth you just go down there and then you give legitimacy to the occupier, to the colonial power? So that was the core of the issue, the main reason of this Palestinian shock across the board. Now, the Palestinian leadership kind of, again, they had this kind of very, as you said, maybe very strong kind of reaction, and then they tried kind of to backtrack, maybe reassessing the whole thing. That was kind of maybe unwise to go full-fledged criticism and attack. We just leave this to maybe to the media, to the Palestinian journalists, and so on and so forth. So I think they, with the second and then the third and the fourth agreements leading to the Moroccan, the last one, the Moroccan agreement, they somehow realized, again, I'm talking about the Palestinian leadership, they realized maybe they have gone off the mark a bit too much in attacking, you know, these governments, and they are losing ground. They can't, and they couldn't, and they can't change the reality. This kind of a thrust, especially with Trump involvement, he and his administration and Israel, everybody, they just kind of got engaged in this. It was as if this was an American domestic issue. And it was amazing until the very last day of the Trump term in power. The main obsession was Palestine, Israel. And he just wanted to shove down, you know, the normalization of Israel down the throat of every single Arab country or people. So it's kind of amazing. So because of all the maybe the fear and what is happening, what if Trump won another term? So I think the Palestinian leadership thought maybe we need to be more pragmatic, and then to tone down our discourse and to try to be kind of more maybe political, and to see if there are kind of some gaps, and if we can mitigate maybe the consequences that are kind of coming out of every single agreement of these. But I think the damage was done, and there was the Palestinian maybe president and leadership, they lacked this kind of balanced maybe approach. So on one day you see this kind of extreme maybe discourse, and then the Palestinian media, the Palestinian official TV, everybody kind of attacking the Emirates, and then suddenly a few weeks after, then this silence that you have alluded to when it comes to Sudan or Morocco. So I think there was a lack of maybe kind of focus, if you like, or calibrated direction that they needed to be, maybe they needed to have more kind of internal debate. What shall we do? And my own criticism of the Palestinian leadership is we all see it coming. It wasn't like a sudden step. So over the past 2, 3, 4 years, all signs were coming from Abu Dhabi, from Bahrain, from Saudi Arabia, from here and there, kind of building up to this kind of direction or to this action. So my question is, what did you do throughout these previous 3, 4, 5 years? Have you met these governments? Have you met these regimes? Have you kind of coordinated, even if they wanted, you know, if they had their decision bluntly and they were kind of vulgar in this and they just wanted this agreement so badly? So at least you could have agreed with them to do it in a way that could be less damaging to the Palestinians, not just to wait on the fence, waiting until that kind of signature takes place, and then you start kind of screaming. So I think there was a lack of Palestinian diplomacy in the past, I would say even 5 years, to mitigate this kind of potential and damage that we all have seen happening. Now, just kind of to conclude, at the larger kind of scale, away from the Palestinian leadership, the damage is huge. In fact, we can't kind of underestimate what have happened, because for the Israeli discourse, first of all, they are saying and they are stressing, and now they have evidence, at least, well, on the face of it, they would say, well, this is not an Arab-Israeli conflict. It is no longer an Arab-Israeli conflict. This is a Palestinian-Israeli dispute. In fact, this is a dispute that we can sort out, maybe later on. The Arabs are kind of out of this. And look at this. We are having kind of normal now diplomatic relations with the Emirates, with Bahrain, so on and so forth. Now, this is kind of, again, it weakens and undermines the Palestinian position, as if you are kind of, again, cutting them off from their natural base of support. Now, the second thing, and maybe this, I don't know, it just kind of came out to my mind, so allow me just to say it. It could kind of straddle this point, this question, and the context as well. And this is something that I have been thinking of, and I'm writing about in my coming book. That is, if you think of the name, the terminology, why on earth they call it the Abraham Accords? So suddenly, this kind of mythical character or whatever, brought from this ancient history, and then his name is used as for all these kind of agreements. The Abrahamic agreements, in fact, accords. So the Bahraini, Emirati, Sudanese, and Moroccan, they are the Abrahamic. This is to say, and the main rationale behind this to say, well, listen, guys, you, me, us, everybody, we belong to the same Abrahamic tradition. And guess what? Our father, our great ancient father, Abraham, he wanted us to do this. And throughout all these millennia, we have been living in this region, we have been doing this and that. So if you take things to that great, grand scale, big scale of again, millennia. So the dispute over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip becomes very minute, very marginal. This is silly. Why, guys? Why are you talking about the West Bank and Gaza Strip when we have that kind of a tradition, that kind of a great history with our grandfather Abraham overseeing this? So you are in fact reducing the current and the present conflict when it's push it against this huge and vast history. This is the Abrahamic Accords. So let us kind of forget about everything, all our kind of little nitty-gritty disputes, and look at Abraham, and then start fresh a new future, which is with this hierarchy, acknowledging the status quo. The core of it is acknowledging the status quo, that is the occupation of Palestine, this even hierarchy and the apartheid system, everything. This is the base of it. So this is the baseline, and we move from here into the future. We don't change it because of this kind of a great scale of things, the Abrahamic scale of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting observation. It's not something that I thought of in relation to this, but it's a very interesting point. And of course, the fact that Israel got so much out of this with absolutely no consequences, nothing they had to give up in the process. I wonder, Ahmed, if you wanted the opportunity to add to that in terms of the Palestinian leadership before we move on to the really obvious question. I'll give you that.
Yes, sure. Actually, coming to the leadership, it is an Israeli-American policy from the very beginning to keep claiming that the Palestinian leadership is the problem. This was the case in the 1930s when Al-Hajj Amin Husseini was the leader of Palestine. This was the case during the PLO leadership and Yasser Arafat leadership for Palestine. This is the case now. It is always trying to find a reason why not to reach a political settlement. So always claiming that the problem is not occupation, the problem is not aggression, it's not settlements, but it is Palestinian leadership. So this is one of the dimensions of the leadership things. The other dimension is that to claim that division between Gaza and West Bank, between Hamas and Fatah is the problem. Actually, if there is no occupation, democracy will be easier. We can have unity can be easier. Gaza and West Bank not are divided mainly because of the Israeli sanction. So it is not leadership. Anyway, coming to the normalization thing, that also trying to portray that Palestinian leadership is hardliner, that they are not accepting settlements. It is just to kind of justify reaching agreements away from the Palestinian leadership. Actually, it is not only the leadership legitimacy that Israel is questioning. It is questioning, and Jared Kushner and the American administration, they are questioning the legitimacy of resistance, of struggle, to including non-violent resistance. Recently, they started to even questioning even the war, the name of Palestine. Now, we in one of the European countries, in Germany, we saw an event that is calling to questioning: can we use Palestine as a name for Palestinians, or it is anti-Semitism? So we have this kind of delegitimize leadership, delegitimize Palestinians, delegitimize Palestine history. This is part of what's happening. In terms of what Khalid mentioned about the reaction of the leadership, it's important here just to explain something. There is a difference actually between one Arab countries and another Arab countries who normalized in terms of few things. For example, Khalid and others, some of the countries who normalized have an open contact with the Palestinian leadership. You can go for discussion with them. You can even protest. You can talk to them. But other countries for years now, not recently, for 5-6 years, are refusing to speak to the Palestinian leadership. So it is different. There are some countries who blackmailed, who have pressured, who were living a difficult situation inside their countries, but other were not under pressure actually. So this is maybe can explain some of the reasons why there is a different reactions from one case to another case. Because if you have an open channel, you can at least express what your thought. But if not, this is a problem. Another thing, and we can see this in the Arab League. If the Arab League is opened as a platform for discussion, Palestinians will go there and discuss what is happening. But if not, here is the problem. So it's important to understand the difference between one case of normalization and the other. Coming also to maybe going to the first question and to this question about Palestine in the larger Arab Middle Eastern context. Let me say that Palestine, especially in this century, 21st century, started to take its human aspect. It is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but also it's a human it's a justice, international law cause. And this is, I think, very important dimension. Our friends around the world we should work together to give. Palestine is not only the cause of the Palestinians. Palestine now, it is the cause of mixing religion with politics. This is very, if you are saying that certain religion has national rights, this is something we need to discuss. The second thing is also Palestine is international law. Palestine is the Trump administration actually went out of environment international deals, went out of trade agreements, went out of every aspect of international law and having unifying growth. So also Palestine should be seen as part of justice, international law, and international legitimacy questions. Thank you.
So I wonder, the obvious question to come to now is Trump. Trump was a catastrophe. Pompeo and Kushner, in charge of Middle East policy, is was a devastating thing for the Palestinians, but I think also the region in a sense. They're gone now. What is the impact of Trump no longer being in charge of Middle East policy and Biden coming in? A question I think for you, Khalid, first, but I think I will also offer it to Ahmed.
Yeah. Well, if you allow me,
Sorry, unfortunately, you've been muted. I don't know if you muted or we've muted you. Do you mind starting again?
Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Maybe I'm gonna refer this question to Ahmed. He is more kind of engaged in politics and around the Palestinian leadership and their assessment of the new coming, the new administration in DC. But I wanted to say maybe to take this kind of my time and highlight another kind of point to do with normalization, which is kind of very interesting. And if we need to contemplate and ponder maybe a bit about this kind of rationale. In most of these cases, in the 4 cases, not most, in all of them, in fact, in all of them, you have this argument saying this is the interest, the national interest of X country, of the United Arab Emirates, of Bahrain, of Sudan, or of Morocco, tells us that we have to do this. So in fact, we are kind of responding to our national interest. Well, sorry for you, the Palestinians, but in fact, we are following our national interest. So you have this kind of debate, which seemingly on the surface, very strong, because I mean, well, you feel like a crippled. If you think this is your national interest, who am I then to come in the way and say, well, you shouldn't do this? So now we need kind of as Palestinians and as people who support Palestine to dismantle this argument, because it's a very powerful argument from my perspective. So number one, who defines the national interest of the United Arab Emirates or even Morocco? Is it one single individual or is it the Moroccan people? How could you claim that cutting off your country from the Arab, the Muslim, and the justness of the cause is something that goes in the national interest of your country? If you side by Israel and then being somehow attacked by all Arab people or Muslims, or is this, where do you place this within the national interest? This is number one. Number two, and more kind of now reflective of the Israel and the Zionist thinking, is the following. From a Zionist perspective, since Herzl until Shimon Peres and Netanyahu nowadays, you have this argument that is prosperity in the region is in fact conditioned on the collaboration with 3 factors: the Israeli mind and technology, the Gulf money and fortune and markets, of course, because you have big markets, Saudi Arabia and others, and cheap labor of what? Of the Palestinians and Egyptians. So you have this triangle over which you can have the so-called prosperity of the region. So this kind of tripartite, if you like, collaboration, if you think of it, is led by the Israeli mind. And this is there. This is in Shimon Peres' book, The New Middle East. And again, repeatedly said by Netanyahu, that we need to merge our forces. What are our forces? Our forces, this is a nickname of me being the leader of the region. I need, well, if you want prosperity in the region, you have to submit, you have to surrender to this idea that the region should be led by the Israeli mind, supported by the Gulf money and by the cheap labor Palestinian and Egyptian hands. So this is, for me, is this the national interest of Saudi Arabia? Does this, being an attributary power, the biggest state, Saudi Arabia, with 30 million people, and the Gulf at large, more than maybe 40, 50 million people, not to mention the rest of the Arab countries. Is this the national interest of the Arabs to say yes to this project? Well, if yes, at least we need to hear the answer from the people, not from one single individual on the top to say, well, this is the national interest of Saudi Arabia or the national interest of United Arab Emirates. I think there is a big question mark on this kind of argumentation that we need again to deconstruct and to say to their people, if this is the national interest of Saudi Arabia, of the Saudis, of the Saudi people, then be it. But at least you need to know it, you need to discuss it, and we need to have some sort of, maybe a referendum. And if they say yes, we the Palestinians, we say, okay, we can't say anything. Now we are, on the hook. We can say no to the will of the Saudi people or the will of the Moroccan people. But because this is not the case, yes, we need to raise our voice and to question these guys and to push them to the corner. No, this is not the national interest of the Moroccans or the Sudanese. The Sudanese and the country of Sudan, one of the biggest in the Arab region, and one of the most fertile. And we used to read in our kind of school textbooks that is, Sudan is, because of the agriculture and the natural fortunes and so on and so forth, can provide the entire Arab country and countries with food. So how come then the national interest of this huge semi-continent country to be linked and destined with a normalization agreement with Israel? You need to explain to us and to the Sudanese people.
I think what you beautifully described there, actually, with those three things, the Israeli mind and the tech, the Gulf money and the cheap labor, you beautifully described the extension of settler colonialism on a regional scale, which Samah, it's almost a pity she wasn't here, but when we interviewed on the radio on the weekend, she sort of talked how the Palestinian struggle, at one point people thought, when the Arabs are free, the Palestinians will be free. And in fact, it's actually the other way around. Once the Palestinians are free, that will be when the Arabs are free, because it is the extension of this settler colonialism. I think this will be the last question. Do you want to answer? Do you want to respond back to that?
Very interesting. Yeah, very interesting point. And Ahmed mentioned this in one of his kind of interventions, that is even in the deal of the century, in Trump's plan. If you see, Ahmed mentioned, rightly so, spotted, this kind of, where do they place the Palestinian economy? If this is for the prosperity and the future of the region, because I write a book about the deal of the century, so I know it even by heart. It's amazing how they kind of perpetuate the present reality with its hierarchy, that I am the leader and you are kind of the laborer down there, you are the cheap laborer and I am the master. This is perpetuated by the deal of the century permanently. So don't think that you can break away from this destiny, from this colonial hierarchy, that I am the master all the time. So even that there is no such a thing called the national Palestinian economy that would have any chance to emerge in the future. According to the plan, every single thing is controlled. So if you need more, maybe space in this sector or labor, this is controlled by the master. Israel should approve of this. Israel should approve of every single Palestinian economic, let alone military, political, or strategic move, even economic. So you are under the thumb permanently. Again, this is settler colonialism. This is the Aborigines in Australia. This is kind of the indigenous people in North America. This is it. We are replicating the same case, however, beautified with a new language now, out of experience. Now we can produce it in a different way. Sorry for taking longer than I should.
It's a good addition. Yeah. I'll go back to my question that I asked. This will be the last question that I put to you. I am going to draw on the audience questions that are coming in. We've got a few sitting there that are really good ones. So if everyone's got questions, please put them in the Q&A so we can put them to the panelists. So Ahmed, to you, the question about you know, what does it mean that Trump is now gone and we're dealing with a Biden administration? We might need to unmute.
Every American president leaves the White House and his ideas leave with him, especially when it comes to the Palestinian-Israeli question. Clinton parameters left with him, Bush the son ideas left with him, and the Trump policy already left with him. But there are still, for example, in the last 2-3 years, there are few acts, laws in the Congress, in the American Congress, that are restricting Biden's administration in its dealing with Palestinians. So there are some legal aspects of the problem now, but in terms of the policy, it's left with him. Trump era in general, it is not something only harming Palestinians. It was maybe the peak of populism around the world. So it's important for everybody to speak. It's the peak of speaking about that you can acquire land by war. You can claim that you are legitimate by occupying through your army another land. This is very dangerous for the whole world. Coming now. What Trump's administration tried to do in terms of conflict management methods, two things. They started at the beginning trying to do a kind of conflict transformation, that Palestinians can accept better job opportunities inside Israeli settlements and inside the Israeli economy, while stop talking about sovereignty, about state, about national determination, national determination, and that Palestinian leadership is hardliner, and because they're refusing such normalization agreements between Palestinian individuals and occupation. When it didn't work, this kind of transformation, they went to kind of conflict resolution by proposing Trump a plan and trying to say that there is no problem now between Israel and other countries. This is conflict resolution. Now coming back to Biden and to the another American administration, similar to administrations before Trump, we are going back, unfortunately, to the conflict management. When some people wanted to see peace, now we used to see peace process, and that this is peace process continue forever. But now some people are saying peace diplomacy or diplomacy process. It is only even not peace process, diplomacy, just contacts. There is now very dangerous documents circulated in Washington among think tanks, pro-Israeli think tanks, speaking about interim Arab-Israeli agreements. If it is not possible to reach normalization now, as some think tanks proposed, okay, Saudi Arabia or others can have a kind of interim agreement with Israel where they start contacts, start a few things, while leaving the full normalization for the future. At the same time that we will try. And all the time when it is coming to the Palestinians, there are kind of vague promises to start a peace process. Everything is related to Israel in the American policy. Nevertheless, what administration is it? It's very clear. Some protection in the United Nations, protection in terms of against the International Criminal Court, protection against all any kind of economical sanctions, or I think it is very clear. But when it comes to the Palestinians, it is maybe in the future we will have East Jerusalem as a capital. Maybe after 4 or 5 years, there will be negotiations for a Palestinian state. It is all the time vague promises. So this is really a problem with all the American administrations. All the international community need to leave conflict management to conflict resolution on the base of ending the occupation, implementing international law. If we are not going toward this path, this approach, there will be always a problem, and there will be a conflict. Look, Israel can normalize with any Arab, African, Asian country, but it will wake up every day and it will find us in front of it. The Palestinian people for more than 100 years didn't capitulate, and we will not. They will wake up every day, they will find us. The problem, the conflict is, the problem is refugees. The problem is occupation. If you don't solve the problem of occupation and refugees, you don't solve anything, and this will be harming for everybody. It will be harming for the human rights. It will be harming for human dignity around the world. So it's very important to give the Palestinian cause, it is a real context of justice and international law, and to know that on the ground, Palestinians inside Palestine and outside Palestine will never stop asking for their national rights, and that this will be a problem forever if it is not solved.
Indeed. And absolutely everything should be on the basis of basic rights and national rights. All right, I might now turn to the questions from the audience. We've had a few come in. I'm going to combine two questions. I think they're touching on similar sorts of issues, and maybe this is a question for you, Khaled. So we've had, on the one hand, we've had a question, could you comment on the rise of Muslim Zionists as a minority phenomenon? And I think it's sort of maybe aimed at a similar kind of point. There's another question that's come in to say that the Arab street differs in views from their leaders who have gone down the path of normalisation suggests that the Arab street has been able to cultivate its own independent views historically. But it has always been subject to, you might disagree with the premise, the Arab street has always been subject to indoctrination by their political and religious leadership for decades to oppose Israel with serious threats to their lives if they happen to stray from an anti-Israel hard line. So isn't it unsurprising that today the Arab street maintains its hostile historical views about Israel? So on the one hand, we've got, the street is anti-Israel, but on the other hand, we're asking about the rise of Muslim Zionists.
Well, the first one, which is kind of the rise of Muslim Zionists, and nowadays we have another kind of terminology, which is, Arab Zionists. The first one, I think maybe, well, yeah, some of small groups and individuals in the States, United States, trying kind of to lobby or to be active in certain ways, and they think, if we keep kind of attaching ourselves to Palestine, this means we are hindering, in fact, our kind of effort to achieve some other maybe causes or whatever. But we have them as well. We have the same idea, the same in the Arab region, and especially in the Gulf. And in fact, I saw some voices in Sudan and Morocco. Now, my claim is all these voices, they are there. They do exist, but they are kind of the minoritarian voices. They are kind of the minority voices, extremely minority. However, they are allowed a great scale of platform and media by these governments. So you have this kind of disproportionate media delivery. So you have these voices coming from X, Y, and Z. Some maybe social media activists. I'm not sure if they're activists, but because they are mouthpieces of the government anyway. So when you say activists, you think you have to be active against the system. But if you are part of the system, in this case, you are just a mouthpiece. Anyway, so you have a few voices, a few names. They are very well known now across the Arab media. Maybe a dozen, but they are very influential because every single tweet that they do will be replicated and retweeted and highlighted even on TV programs and coverage. So it gives you this kind of impression that you have a rising mini Arab street that is accepting what is happening. So my question mark is on this kind of portrayal, on this manufacturing of the public opinion, as if you are trying to say, well, the public opinion, in fact, is supportive of this move. Well, I have an issue with this unless you have a free and fair a process of assessment that people, we know the real kind of pulse of the people. Until now, we don't have it. We don't have it. If you have a voice, Saudi, Emirati, Bahraini voice that is supportive of the normalization, they will be given a daily platform to deploy and deliver their message. On the contrary, we haven't heard until this very moment, now we have almost a year, or well, maybe less than a year, not a single Emirati voice from within the country saying, well, I am against what happened and they are still free. There was only one voice of a female writer, and then she said this in a post on Facebook, and then she disappeared. Nobody knows where she is. Is she in prison? She's silenced and home, kind of, nobody knows. At the same time, you have dozens and dozens and dozens of voices. We are not sure even of their names, if they exist or just fake names of the same person. They support the official move. So I think, yes, in a way, yes, you have this kind of Zionist, Arab and Muslim Zionist, maybe voices or group, but I don't know for sure what size is this group and how representative is it to the reality, in fact. Because again, everything is played with and really kind of manufactured and fabricated. And we discovered, because I do some of my academic work on Arab media, you have thousands of names on Twitter and social media, simply fake. They are fake names. They don't belong to anybody. You don't have a person. These are kind of bots and the stuff. Armies of people on social media. So you would say, well, look at these kind of Arab and Muslim Zionists. But in fact, and some of them, by the way, some of the names, even were kind of operated by some Israeli even agencies. So everything is messed up. So we really don't know the topography of the public opinion.
And the second part of that question, which I've actually got another question that's come in that's sort of conflicting with that question. So on the one hand, it was like, how can we really, if you say that the street is anti-Israel, yet they've been indoctrinated for so long to be anti-Israel, can we really believe this? Maybe they just need to get to know Israel. On the one hand, we've got this question. And on the other hand, I've got someone here saying, I beg to differ with regards to Dr. Khalid's trust in the will of the Saudi and Emirati people. Not only are people being brainwashed to accept the decisions of the government with regards to Palestine and Qatar and before that, but also they are not allowed to speak. It's not democratic at all. So we've got difference of opinions in the audience as to what's happened and what's the implication of the lack of democracy. Would you speak to that?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult. I mean, I live in Qatar and I know so many kind of Qatari people, friends and university and here and there. And when we talk about kind of normalization, I can sense this, they have a clear cut, as my Emirati friends that I know for years and I know very well, and I know their position. They can't speak out. They can't speak up their opinion. Too much at stake. So this is kind of the thing. The same goes in Saudi Arabia. So when you have kind of authoritarian kind of regime, I'm not saying that, yes, you have voices, maybe they are kind of convinced, brainwashed, or for whatever kind of reason, they believe in whatever their government has done. But my argument is that this is extremely, extremely minoritarian segment of the society. Now, the thing is, we need, I mean, some people, I think you mentioned something like, some people, they need to know more about Israel. Not from me, I'm kind of depicting a kind of colonial negative image about Israel. Okay, be it. I am more than happy to even to lead you for a tour inside Israel. Then I tell you about my own village, That is kind of 2/3 of the land was confiscated in 1948, and we live under 2 settlements here and there. And my village lived in a valley at the receiving end of the sewage of these 2 settlements. And we have so many kind of cases at the court. Please stop the sewage. This is a colonial mind. I didn't say it, but I can show it to you if you want to see the reality of Israel on the ground. But this kind of beautified image about Israel as democratic, flashy, nice. You go to the streets of Tel Aviv, everything is nice, all these brands. And yeah, of course, you can create any reality that you want. But if you say behind this, this is an apartheid system, guys. Even against the Palestinians who hold Israeli passports, let alone the other Palestinians. By any single, I would say, sane individual, average layman, you just take them, tell them the story, let them see that. Well, let an Israeli tour guide take them to the Palestinian refugees and to Tel Aviv and let them come up with their own impression.
Mm.
All the tours that come from the US to Israel for the young Jewish kind of people, they tried their best not to take them to the West Bank and the other side of the wall. Why is this? We'll take them, the Israeli guide, the right-wing Zionist even guide, take them and they try to tell them whatever kind of story. I am sure if they see the things on the ground, this is it. This is the reality. So the reality tells you, and there is no need for me or for any Palestinian academic, but I challenge you that take any impartial person to Palestine to see the reality, and then I leave it to them. If they say the Palestinians should stay in whatever kind of destiny, be it.
Thank you. A question for Ahmed. Could you please shed light on the role played by Jared Kushner in the process of normalization, please? And what are the possible economic benefits for the states that have participated in the normalization?
Sure. Talking on Jared Kushner and the American ambassador, Mr. David Friedman, and maybe Jason Greenblatt, also the peace envoy at the beginning of the Trump administration. All this group, with also Sheldon Adelson, the billionaire, all this group is a kind of Zionist ideologist group. Where on earth an ambassador for a country carry 5 pounds hammer? And this is, you can find it on YouTube, you can find it in the media. David Friedman, the American ambassador, carrying 5 pounds hammer and demolishing Palestinian house in the village of Silwan near Jerusalem. This was the team who we are dealing with. Jared Kushner and Greenblatt tried to create a new Palestinian representation or new Palestinian leadership. They created something called the Chamber of Commerce and Industry for Yehuda and Samaria, which is the Israeli name for the West Bank. They tried to find businessmen to be part of the New Deal of century, taking them to Bahrain. One of them, who actually, the most famous one of them, we found that he has 12 cases in the court against him, a very small businessman with a lot of criminal problems. This is what Jared Kushner tried to do at the beginning inside Palestine, including helping to keep and sustain the division between Gaza and West Bank. A famous meeting happened in the White House to try to, 6 Arab countries participated in a meeting with to discuss how to ease problems in Gaza without speaking to Palestinians. And the most important thing, there was a kind of solutions. We can ease humanitarian problems in Gaza, but we need division to continue. So we had at the beginning Kushner and Greenblatt and Friedman. Some of them, including Kushner and Greenblatt, both of them were settlers. Both of them were supporting settlers, fundraising, organized fundraising for settlements. So this is at the beginning, this is the group we are dealing with. They tried at the beginning to transform conflicts to be a kind of Palestinian muscles working in the Israeli economy. When it didn't work, they used a lot of methods, including blackmailing and a kind of that they can open the gate of the White House, they can protect some politicians from criticism in the international media and in the Washington in exchange of normalization with Israel. This is the group we dealt with. Anyway, I think this is will not work. First of all, Palestinians have a kind of, we know that we have problems in terms of democracy. We know that we need to have elections soon. We know that we have division, but this is partly because of occupation. It is not easy to deal with such problems. One of the major problems we face now in elections that we need elections to happen in Jerusalem. According to the interim peace agreements with Israel, Palestinians are entitled to participate in elections in Jerusalem. But we have the division problem. It is partly and major part of it because of the continuation of the occupation. But Palestinians, anyway, they have their, Palestinians are not ignorant people. Palestinians have their own culture. They have their own strength. They have their own history, and they can continue. So Kushner and Greenblatt tried to say that there is nothing called Palestinian people, and because so there is no need for Palestinian state. Then they transformed this to try to say that state can be not a state. They can name it a state, but it is not a state. I think all of this left now, but the problem now we have that while the international community, with the new administrations, many governments around the world recognize the right of the Palestinians to have their own state, but they didn't recognize, they didn't recognize the state. They recognize the right of the state, but they don't recognize the Palestinian state. They recognize the need of the state, but they refuse to have any kind of policy that makes Israel pay the price of occupation. Without Israel paying the price of occupation, nothing will happen on the ground.
Indeed. Okay, I think I've got 3 more questions before we wrap up tonight. What is the impact? I think this might be a question for you again, Ahmed. What is the impact, if any, do you think, of the recent ICC decision? I think. Yeah.
ICC decision is very important, not only for Palestinians. It's for the Palestinians, it's very important because at the beginning it is agreed that Palestinians are recognized as a state according to the international law and according to the court regulations, which is very important thing because for many years what's happened, Israel signed agreement with us Palestinians in 1993, 1994, in a process that should be an interim agreement that by 1999 we should reach the final status agreement. According to the signed agreements, Palestinians have sanction or immunity in their cities, what we call Area A. Israel cannot come to arrest or to invade such Area A, but Israel is coming to Area A every day. According to the interim agreement, Area A must be expanded to reach all the West Bank, excluding the built area of settlements. So according to the interim agreements, Palestinians by 1999 were supposed to control their lands. According to the interim agreement, Palestinians, policemen, and security were supposed to be in the borders. We were there between 1994 to 1999, but then Israel eliminated our presence there. According to the agreement, we have right to our water. We have a shrinking share of water. Israel is taking fresh water, selling to us. So there are at least 20 agreements that Israel is not respecting in terms of interim agreement, but it's said because we have an interim agreement, we were not supposed to go to the ICC or other things, and that we agreed to this. So Israel is not respecting agreements, they're using it, and so the last decision of the ICC said that this claim is not valid. Palestine are entitled to go to the international courts. Palestine, and the resolution is very important because according to the Trump administration and to the Israeli current government, and by the way, we have in Israel always now the competition between right wing and right wing, between hardliners and hardliners. We don't have peace camp, unfortunately, there. There's no partners, unfortunately, there. They are trying to say that international law is not applicable in the case of Palestine. Human rights is not applicable here. So Palestinians are not entitled to be dealt as a people. This decision of the ICC is very important because it is coming after the populist era of Trump. It is coming in an era where the whole world community is struggling to keep its international orders and international law and international organization. This is very important decision.
Sorry. I think it's a very exciting development, although many years before we're going to see something more tangible out of it. But a question for you, Khaled. So while nearly all Palestinians see the betrayal of normalization for what it is, could you speak to the issue of the fake resistance countries and agencies? This seems to often be ignored. And particularly the issue of Iran, and this questioner is calling it the fake resistance offered by Iran.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say the same kind of, you have so many similarities. Maybe this is kind of, if you have, I can think of it as maybe the negative of an image. So it's kind of the same image. Maybe you have positive, you have negative, without any connotation to positive or negative. Both of them are negative, but you have the similarities in the sense of the exploitation of the case of Palestine for the interest of the regime. Now, what I am saying, kind of conceptually speaking, is this kind of interesting move and shift that historically speaking in the region, we used to know all these, I like the term, in fact, this kind of very creative, fake resistance states like Syria or whoever, or Iran. And so they used as a pretext Palestine for their own political ends. This is a very well-known story. So they would say, well, we are not kind of, we don't have the luxury for democratization, let's say, in Syria, because we are busy in preparing for the war against Israel, so on and so forth. And this preparation took them 4 decades, at least, for Assad dynasty, the father and the son. And the same goes for me with Iran. So Iran, since the Khomeini revolution, 1979, 1980, you are talking about 40 years, more than half of the age of the state of Israel. And since that year, 1980, and you are saying you are planning, you are doing this to fight Israel, to do this and that. But effectively speaking, that was only rhetoric. But you have the main interest, the main agenda is somewhere else. Yet you are using this as a camouflage, as again an umbrella under which you can do so many other things. So for Arab regimes, think of Syria, think of Iraq, think of Jordan as well. Jordan, no fight with Israel, and yet they used martial laws for many decades, saying we are in a state of war against Israel. what kind of war? But again, that was to say, we don't need, the talk about democracy, the talk about political freedoms in the country are postponed and kind of not allowed even. Now, the shift that we are seeing nowadays, again, if you think of these 4 cases of normalization, is that the use of Palestine, again, for the national interest, but exactly in a reverse way, saying we are kind of sacrificing Palestine for the sake of the national interest. On that side, again, in the other case, that was exploiting the slogan of Palestine for the national interest of the regime. I wouldn't say even the national interest of the country. No, maybe this is too much. I think the more accurate term is the political agenda of the regime. So for the political agenda of the Assad regime, Syrian regime, this kind of exploitation of Palestine. So hence the fake resistance thing. There is no resistance. And nowadays you have kind of, again, the political agenda of the regimes is hovering around sacrificing, surrendering, the case of Palestine. So I see them both in the same boat, in fact, all these kind of regimes. And this is why, for me, I think in the long term, if we zoom out, if we want to think of a wider perspective, historically speaking, for our activism and our struggle as Palestinians and our supporters everywhere within the Arab countries and even beyond, my perspective is the freedom for Palestinians from colonialism and occupation is the twin for the freedom of the Arab peoples from their own authoritarianism and dictatorships. And these 2 struggles, in fact, they go hand in hand, because you can't do it without free men. If you are colonized in your own country, though independent, on the facade of independence, but in fact it's colonized by this authoritarian regime that functions in the bigger kind of equation of American colonialism or American hegemony, or they are just they are servants of the bigger guys, the bigger masters. One right-wing American Zionist writer, I think in the Foreign Affairs a couple of issues ago, he said something like, the onus is on Israel's rivals to prove that their interest is in line with the American interest in the region, so that we, the Americans, we look after them. So if you are not kind of in line with that imperial American interest, then again, automatically you are classified as maybe second, third, whatever kind of 10th party in the region. So I think all these kind of regimes nowadays, they are functionaries of a bigger kind of system that is the imperial system in the region. It is not, they are not functionaries of the national interest of their own countries. No, that is, the last maybe thing that they can think of. Otherwise, how could we understand that all these, especially in the Gulf, wealthy countries, that they had independence for more than a century, half a century at least, they couldn't make it as independent, autonomous, political players, that they depend on themselves and on their own people. And they rely on external powers to provide for security, to provide for everything. And nowadays, to line themselves, up behind Israel as their regional protector from a bigger threat, which is scandalous. It's a farce, in fact. I don't know, maybe I'm kind of digressing and venting out some of my frustration.
I am just looking at the time, and I think our participants might allow us just to wrap up with one final question, because I don't think we can finish this conversation without this particular question. And maybe it will be something for the future, I think. But it is 9:30, so I'm going to ask you to keep your responses to this final question a little bit short so we can wrap up more or less on time. But it is the issue of Western Sahara. We have a question from the panel there. It was an obvious thing to us when we were organising this. In fact, we did try and get a speaker that could speak on the issue of Western Sahara. It seems an obvious parallel to what is happening in Palestine, and yet it's somehow complex, the response to it. Where is the expression of solidarity with the Sahrawi people and the outrage in that aspect of the deal? And I guess this speaks to a broader question of the collaboration and the opportunity for cross struggles to come together, the Palestinian struggle being part of a more global struggle. I'll give you both an opportunity to respond briefly to that as our closing remarks.
Shall I start? Yeah, actually, Sarah, let me say that what Khalid is raising about the imperialist regime in the region, maybe this is something need a lot of discussion. I think there is a lot of, according to the Trump administration and even Obama's administration before that, there are a kind of withdrawal from the Middle East. There are of the withdrawal of American immediate or actual presence in the region and trying to starting a new Middle East with the new allies in the region. We should, I cannot elaborate a lot about this in a short time, but I think there is a kind of a new regional order happening, and this is important to look about it. Referring to the question of other problems and other conflicts in the Middle East and around the world, actually, this is the problem that we faced with the Trump administration, and this is the very problem with the Israeli occupation and the international position toward the Israeli occupation. If you don't want to apply international law and you don't want to see reality on the ground, there is a problem. If you are speaking about what Kushner, going back to Kushner is trying to say that the problem is good governance. Good education. Okay, we have a problems of governance and education, but the occupation is the reality on the ground is occupation. Reality on the ground are refugees. Reality on the ground that there is settlements. Such problems must be solved, and all other problems around the world must be solved according to one approach of human rights and international law. And this is why I think we Palestinians and all the people who believe in justice and freedom around the world need to think again that their connection, their relation to Palestine is a relation of human values. Occupation is totally against against advancement of humanity. It is again, occupation is something, keep 6-7 million refugees around the world, and the United States and other countries want now to destroy the UNRWA, to leave such millions of refugees in the middle of nowhere. This is really something harming the whole humanity. Thank you.
Thank you. And you've just touched on an issue we didn't even get to, UNRWA, and what all this does to UNRWA. But Khalid, the final word with you. Yeah, well, regarding Western Sahara, it's really very kind of delicate and very, very complicated, you know, just in a couple of statements at the very end of our talk. But maybe it suffices to say there has been a UN-led process over there. I wouldn't claim any expertise in the whole issue, but you know, at least with the parameters, you know, this is kind of a case of self-determination, and that was acknowledged by the UN, and there was, I think, a phased-out process for referendum and so on and so forth. Now, the point is, now this process, however slow it has been going through, now it has been blocked, it has been damaged because of the normalization. Because of the normalization, the political blackmailing that we have witnessed is so scandalous that we are ready to derail the whole process, to take it out of this UN-led, maybe for 3-4 decades now, a process, and even to destroy it in return of the Moroccan government's open diplomatic relationship with Israel. So this is kind of for me, this is the imperialistic chaos that has been kind of imposed on the region
by Trump administration, that we are ready to destroy anything for the sake of this spoiled child called Israel in the region. And we go to the full length. We are ready to do anything against common sense, against UN resolutions, again, let alone, of course, human rights or all self-determination. But this is it. So part of the solidarity, in fact, with the Sahrawis and with the cause is to say, this kind of normalization step between Morocco and Israel is completely against the basics of this of the issue of the Western Sahara issue, and it should go back to the UN led process, to say the least.
Look, I'm going to have to wrap it up there. I really, there's so many issues I feel like we just didn't even touch on. The refugees, what can our government do, what we should be doing. But I think I can see in the chat that people are really appreciative of this discussion, this opportunity to talk about this issue. It's complex, it's big, and it has massive ramifications, not just for Palestine, but for the whole region. I really want to thank the both of you for the time, for the expertise that you have offered. It really has been really great for all of us. I think we've learned a lot. For everybody that's following us, if you want to get involved as an active member of our group, please go check out our website, check out our Facebook page, send us an email. You're welcome to join us on Zoom on Sunday at 2 o'clock. Send us an email or turn up in person. We're going to be organising and hopefully building our presence in Melbourne so people can really start to understand all aspects of the Palestinian struggle. It is a just struggle, it is a human rights struggle, and one day Palestine will be free. Shukran Kathir.
Shukran. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Muayyad, everybody. And let me at the end say you are welcome to Palestine anytime. Please feel free to contact us here in Palestine for any purpose. Thank you.
Shukran كثير, Doctor. It was amazing. It's fantastic. The people feedback really great, and I'm really happy and appreciate your contribution.
شكرا.
شكرا دكتور خالد. شكرا لكم.
Thank you very much.
سلام.